Hail, Lairsons! Welcome to the Wyvern's Lair. I am Dungeon Master Wyvern, and in this brand new podcast series, I invite you to join me on a quest to seek out maverick developers and unlock the inciting secrets behind their games. And for the inaugural episode of this series, I am honored to host legendary game designer Raph Koster, also known as Designer Dragon. Raph's pioneering work as lead designer on Ultima Online and creative director for Star Wars Galaxies has given millions of people across the world a chance to live out the virtual lives of their dreams. And now, Raph has returned to the genre he helped establish with Stars Reach, a deep science fantasy, massively multiplayer online sandbox featuring complex simulated living worlds, a shardless galaxy, exciting action combat, and epic player-governed cities and planets. I recently had the privilege of speaking with Raph, together with special guest Greg Havlusch, the producer of Broadsword Online games for Ultima Online. And I invite you to join Greg and me as we speak with Raph about his enduring legacy in timeless classics like Ultima Online, and together look ahead to Raph's next great adventure with Stars Reach. Raph, Greg, thank you so much for making the time to join me today. I'd like to kick off this discussion with a round of introductions. Obviously, you both don't need much in the way of introductions, but I thought let's go ahead and frame the conversation by starting there. Greg, why don't you go ahead and kick us off here?
Certainly. My name is Greg Havlusch. I am the producer for Ultima Online. And prior to that, I spent many years designing content for UO. And before that, I was an event moderator, and that's how I got my start on this project too many years ago than I like to count, but where I'm at now.
Greg, thank you so much for making the time for this. Over to Raph Koster.
So I'm Raph, and I was Designer Dragon back when I originally led design on Ultima Online. And since then, I did MUDs before that, and afterwards I did Star Wars Galaxies and a world called Metaplace, and I'm currently working on a new sandbox MMO called Stars Reach.
So speaking of Stars Reach, this is what brings us together today to tie the past to the present and the future for both Stars Reach and, of course, Ultima Online, which is a sort of a cornerstone legacy in your portfolio as a developer. Raph is the torch that you are currently carrying, Greg. So to frame this conversation, I'd like to check and see if Rick would mind playing for us your vision video that introduces Stars Reach as an exciting new MMO.
Hi, my name is Raph Koster, and I've been making online worlds for a long time now. The thing is, people think they know what an MMO is. It's leveling up, it's killing purples, it's DPS counts and instances and all that jargon. It's time-consuming with a zillion HUD elements on screen. It's running through static zones and being the same chosen one as everyone else. We don't think MMOs have to be that way. Long ago, an incredibly powerful ancient alien civilization terraformed whole arms of the galaxy to create what they called their garden. And they left behind their works, their robot servitors that to this day follow the orders of their long-vanished masters, and of course the legacy of their genetic engineering, which includes us. A science fantasy setting full of lore and secrets, factions to join, and mysterious artifacts. It's time for trees that grow, for creatures that steal your stuff and take it back to their lairs. If you neglect that alien infestation over there, it might expand and grow towards your house. Every one of our creatures runs AI like The Sims, and they live on thousands of planets because we leverage the power of the cloud to have a single shardless galaxy of worlds, all of them terraformable and with permanence, so what you change is saved. Planets you and your friends can build on and settle. We're in the great tradition of games like Ultima Online, Star Wars Galaxies, RuneScape, Minecraft, and Eve, but we want to look forward, not back. That means players able to choose their own fun, whether it's blasting away at alien monsters, leading a village, exploring strange new worlds, or cornering the market on rocket ships. It means great character customization, not gender-locked classes and limited gear. And above all, it means recognizing that it takes all kinds of players and all sorts of play styles to really make an alternate world. We use skill tree advancement because, let's face it, getting out-leveled by your friends kinda sucks. It should be up to you whether you want to solo a tough critter or gather a group of 50 to take down an alien spider dragon. It should be up to you whether you work on building your house solo or bring together your guild to found a city. And someday your guild might govern that planet, and then you'll be able to decide whether to make it into a roleplay heaven or a wretched hive of scum and villainy. I know, these are big dreams. We've built a lot, but there's more still to do. And it's time to bring you into the process. That's why we want to invite you along on our journey as we reach for the stars. And we'll be showing you things a little more raw and unfinished than you might get to see normally with a game in development. But this game is for you. You should get to help shape it. So, if you want to help us reach the dream of worlds that feel alive and alternate realities to call home, join us on starsreach.com, where we'll be posting design material regularly. Join the Discord, where we'll be hosting regular dev chats, and help us build space for everyone.
All right. And so following this video, Raph, could you please share with us what makes Stars Reach so special and exciting for you as an MMO developer? And secondly, could you share with us 3 of the most exciting features and or systems that Stars Reach offers players?
So I think the thing that excites me most as a developer, and I'll go back to referencing things about UO as a reference point. Back when we did UO and we made it so you could chop down trees, which wasn't a thing in games until UO really, hard to believe today, but we couldn't make the trees go away, right? We wanted to make it so that when you chopped a tree, it disappeared, but we had to bake the trees onto the CD-ROM, right? And so having worlds that are static, that are pre-made, that can't evolve, we were trying to make UO into a world that evolved, and because of the technological limits of the time. And Stars Reach is set up so that everything evolves, everything changes. Examples of that would include everything about the terrain is morphable. You can dig tunnels, you can do all those kinds of very Minecrafty things, but it goes further than that. Every plant in the world is actually a mob that grows there, can throw off seeds and propagate, can spread, can burn or die because the climate changes or the weather is bad or it just doesn't get enough water. So it's really meant to be a fully living galaxy, right? And the result of that we've seen are probably where we get the 3 cool things, right? I'll just name a couple of things. One of our players has been experimenting a lot with the simulation physics in the game, and they just got a steam-powered fountain working that we didn't know was possible. They got heat pumps to work. We didn't know that was possible. They are catching us by surprise with the kinds of things that they are getting to happen using the game sim. Because the simulation, we know the humidity, the temperature, the materials, the chemical state of matter for every cubic meter of the world. You know, rocks can melt and all kinds of things. Another really cool moment that emerged out of that was actually when players discovered that if they dug down under a lake, and it drained all the way down until it reached lava, the water would then hit the lava, turn as a geyser. The steam would go so high into the atmosphere, it would freeze, and an ice cap would fall from up there and plug the geyser, and then it would slowly melt, and the geyser would go off periodically. And this happened entirely organically without us writing any code to make it happen. That was just sort of a jaw-dropping moment for us, right? When people do things that we don't expect. Another thing that's been happening lately, there's always incentives for players, of course, to chop down all the trees, but there's been a guild formed for Nature Conservancy, and they are going around and reforesting all the planets and doing something very much like building rune libraries. They're gathering genetic samples of every type of plant in the game, and they're making seed vaults, which is just kind of awesome too. So yeah, our goal with Stars Reach is to build the same kind of alternate living that UO is, that Star Wars Galaxies is, and so on. A world that surprises you with all the living elements in it because it's simulated rather than, handcrafted cardboard sets.
Very well said, Raph. I'm so very pleased that Greg Havlusch was able to make the discussion here because, unlike myself, he actually knows what he's talking about, has been immersed in MMO development for pretty much his entire professional life, and sandbox emergent gameplay forward games like Ultima Online. So I'm curious as to, your thoughts there, Greg, on what Raph is sharing about some of the highlights for him working on his next outing.
Yeah, I mean, I think he said it best at the top, right? What they tried to do with the original design of UO was make it into the most living and most evolving world that you could have based on the state of the technology. And as the technology has advanced and allowed developers to push the envelope, I mean, I don't know that there's anybody better suited in seeing what's going to come out of Raph's crazy head, right? Like, I think that, there were two things specifically when he was talking about the different feature sets that struck me as like, over the years of development on UO, we have tried to get as close as we could within the confines of what is essentially the same technology that UO was built on originally back in the day. I remember the first bit of content that I did when I started working behind the scenes on UO was an event that had to do with Lord Blackthorn being reintroduced, and there was a healing component to it. And as I was going through the script that handles all of the healing, I found a comment, and it said something to the effect of, handling the rumpled terrain in T2A, we have to do these Z checks. And at the very end of the comment, it just said Raph. And it was at that point, I was like, it struck me, it's like, wow, here's this thing that I played when I was in middle school, and a decade and a half later, it's like, Raph Koster wrote this. This is kind of cool. So I'll try not to, fangirl too hard, but I think that, when it comes to seeing what is possible, the gold standard is to create that virtual ecology that, was so core to what the original design intent was, but was only limited by the state of technology. So it's really exciting to see.
I will say that, I personally am so incredibly excited to see how you and many of your team members have carried forward Ultima Online over the years, Greg, and have evolved it in all kinds of exciting and new directions. So you absolutely, you had a great foundation to work off of, and you and your team, Bonnie, Armstrong, and everyone else that's passed through Broadsword's doors over the years, they've done some great things for Ultima Online and your player community over there, which kind of really helps sort of segue us into my next question here. Stars Reach represents a brand new development journey for you, Raph. However, your first MMO, Ultima Online, continues strong with Greg here and the Broadsword Online Games team after almost 30 years. And Star Wars Galaxies lives on through fan-supported emulators, as we all know. What, in your opinion, has made your pioneering work on Ultima Online such an enduring experience for hundreds of thousands of players? And what, if any, of that magic design DNA for Ultima Online exists in Stars Reach?
Well, to be honest, I think of it as the third in the trilogy. To me, the ideal that is shared by all three games is really that notion of building an alternate reality, right? That you can go visit. And the emphasis of what we tried to simulate or mimic from regular reality, if you want to call it that, is slightly different in each, right? Like in UO, it was, let's have this ecology system that can try to create content. And, Richard Garriott actually gets chunks of the story wrong, but everybody knows his version because of that Ars Technica video that went so viral. But suffice to say, we ran short on CPU and on player behavior to actually be able to support the ecology. But the elements underneath it, which were what we call the resource system, are still how, elements of UO crafting and whatnot still work that way to this day, right? This idea of having these underlying simulated properties. That idea carried forward into Galaxies, but the thing that we were trying to model was much more economic, right? There was a lot more attention paid to the ways in which different play styles interconnected and served each other. By the time, I was thinking about the design of Stars Reach, my take was, we have the CPU to do the original UO ecology, so let's bring it back. So we're going to do that. And we also are doing that galaxy's interdependency. But the new element that is the kind of the centerpiece thing that we're doing with the simulation is the simulating the environment using this, it's called cellular automata. It's like Conway's Game of Life. And bringing that into the mix allows us to have a world where if you dump a pile of ground, it stays up, but if you dump a pile of sand, it falls over. If you tunnel through soft dirt, it may collapse on you. If rivers flow through the dirt, they might erode away their embankments and cause a flood, right? It really gives us the ability to do environmental dynamics that you just can't do in worlds where you have a static handcrafted map, right? I bet you actually could retrofit that in a 2D height field way back into UO. It's probably a decent size lift, but in many ways, those ideas are direct children of the things that we were doing with UO. It's just that gradually over time, as the tech has evolved, it's allowed us to just keep pushing the boundaries on what makes for an alternate world. And, some of the result of that is that when you run around in Star's Reach, pretty often you find yourselves doing exactly the same thing you would in UO, because we're just kind of stacking one idea on top of another, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, like, if you look at the original, I'll call it era of UO from pretty much launch until sometime around when, like, Age of Shadows was released. I think over time, as a necessity of responding to what the overall MMORPG market was moving towards, the game shifted away from being that just straight up simulation, right? There had to be more content for players to do that was in competition with what other games were doing from a content perspective. So, over nearly 30 years, like, you've got to dive in somewhere and pull as much as you can out of, well, we've done this, we've done that, how can we change it? But still, you're semi-limited by the underlying tech. It's interesting that Raph brought up the resource system. Like, that's all still there, right? It never got removed, and like our players are constantly like giving us requests about making more items stackable. And one of the requirements to make an item stackable is that the item must have resources. So if it's like a pile of cloth, it needs to have cloth resources associated with it. Somewhere along the way, the ability to add resources to items became very challenging.
Oh no.
Yeah. So I'm sure those original tools were easy, or at least less dreadful to use back in the day. But these days, it's like, and I keep begging our engineer to, like, Steven, please fix this, but or make it easier. But it's still all there. And I've tried to, in the years that I was working on as a designer, tried to kind of leverage some of that. But again, like, I think it goes back to the player experience, right? Like, players will do what players are going to do, and if it means that you kill all the rabbits and then the wolves are going hungry, et cetera, like, that still happens today. So I'll be interested to see how that kind of evolves in this new project.
Yeah, the in original UO, of course, way back when, even before T2A, our hope was that we would have a lot more traditional static content in the game than we did, because we were really getting pushed to launch before we thought we were ready. There were lots of pieces of content that we were not able to actually launch with. And that included, we had hoped to have quests and a quest system. We planned on adding way more handcrafted content into the dungeons and whatnot. I think the hedge maze is probably still there.
Sure is.
Yeah, but that was meant to actually have a bit more to it, right, than just the maze. But we just ran really, really short on time to be able to put in more of that content and material.
Despite the fact that there wasn't that, like, handcrafted content, just it's kind of like what you said, giving the set for players to kind of build their own stories was some of the most fun I ever had when I was playing. Like, we didn't need to have a quest system, but having a hedge maze meant we could come up with our own little storylines and little quests ourselves and basically do that within our community, and it was really, really cool and fun to play.
Yeah, so this was actually the original intended map, and as you can see, we were planning on having a world 4 times the size.
Wow.
Of what you originally got, and there was no way to actually pull that off. People who are diehard Ultima players might recognize Serpent Isle as one of these 4 continents. And the idea that there are 4 lands in Britannia actually dates back to the very earliest Ultima. So there was a lot of lore stuff that we were trying to do, right? These 4 lands all had names. I forget them all. I have actually scanned these. They are up on my website somewhere. And then this next one will actually maybe just depress you a little, because this and the next one are what I gave Dennis Lubé for making a map that probably many of you own. So if that looks familiar.
Wow.
Yes, Lands of Danger and Despair, the feudal lands. That's exactly it. Britannia and Serpent Isle. That was... The key thing when you look at this is actually to look at what went away. The islands of the Aliki are not there. This little, what is that, Sutek is not there. There is no city of Taratha on the northern end there, right? Like, an awful lot of these things are gone. And in fact, so many of them are gone that I had to draw Dennis a second version of the map. And you can see how many of them... Poor Taratha just got chopped off at the head and is just missing. And a lot of the assets that we had built for those locations and those cultures ended up being used for Second Aid. The Aliki's tropical huts are what we built T2A with. And Taratha, and it was a spider demon worshipping culture. That's where the big heavy stone block architecture that you see in T2A came from, right? So we did reuse material, but there was a lot of stuff that we wanted to have in the original release and we couldn't,
Violet, we have several people from the Discord community here at the Wyvern's Lair, and of course, I believe we have folks from the Stars Reach Discord with us for this conversation. Violet, a longtime community member, saying, sounds like content ideas for Greg. I'm pretty sure. Actually, I don't know. Raph and Greg, have you been in touch in the past?
No, actually, in all the years, I mean, I've had the pleasure of meeting Richard and Star on a couple of occasions, but Raph and I never had the opportunity to cross paths. So that's why I was also eager to do this, because I always wanted to meet and chat with them.
Fantastic. Yes, no, I was excited for this as well. Obviously, you heard a little bit about Greg's biography, Raph, but for a large chunk of his career at Broadsword Online Games, he was, in effect, the lead designer for the live team for many, many years. And I thought it could be so interesting to bring Greg together with you, obviously, for the fact that he spent so many years servicing Ultima Online as the lead designer, and now, of course, as lead producer. And you, as designer Dragon, sort of established the cornerstone upon which a lot of Greg's work has continued to be built upon. I was excited to bring you both together here.
I used to get occasional tech support questions from Broadsword long ago. I'm talking like 15 plus years ago. I remember at one point they reached out and said, hey, I think I just fixed the fruit trees that weren't working, because I wrote the original fruit tree script way back when. What was another one? It was about the world building stuff. Somebody at some point they let me know that they were still using kind of the little world building menu that I made originally, which hides one of the ugliest parts of the entire UO codebase, which was this horrendous little dynamic map editing language that literally got written in the middle of the night in about 3 hours, the night we opened the alpha test. And it allows things like doing search and replace and whatnot over the map and placing trees and things like that. And I built that front end for T2A, but 15 years ago, someone from Broadsword told me, yeah, we still use that to make our maps.
I do want to take the opportunity to share some of the comments coming here from our participants in this discussion. We have one from Matt saying, a core memory of Star Wars Galaxy for me was the way that resources were distributed across planets in different types and strengths. In watching the evolution of fields of ore miners pop up, passively mine for a while with bellows of smoke in the air, and then disappear after the resources were tapped. It made exploring the planets feel very necessary and alive. Thank you, Matt, for that comment. And I believe we are going to see more of that diamonism in Stars Reach. Sounds like it. And Violet apparently is also a Stars Reach supporter. Thank you, Violet, for supporting Raph, Rick, and the rest of the team at Playable Worlds as they embark upon this voyage in Stars Reach. And that actually brings me to the next part of the interview for this evening. You know, you're on record as saying that a major thematic influence for Stars Reach was a 1970s Japanese sci-fi series. Now, I'm going to butcher the name here, Raph. You got to help me out with it. Thank you so much. And just to give people an idea of what this series kind of looked like, or the flavor of it, I'm going to go ahead and share one of the opening credit scenes here with you all. So let me just...
Yeah, the story here is this was actually essentially a Japanese ripoff of Star Wars that blended Star Wars things with a whole bunch of basically, martial arts action and whatnot with classic goofy special effects.
It's epic. I'm going to go ahead and play it.
It is epically cheesy, yeah.
Matt says, listen to those sweet bass guitar licks. Yeah, that was something else, Raph. Could you explain why the show significantly influenced the design of Stars Reach? And second, could you explain how this thematic influence will manifest elsewhere in your upcoming MMO?
Sure. Now, I do want to say, it's not like it's the only influence. It's one of a bunch that are in the mix. Stars Reach pulls from the days when science fiction was optimistic and about grand adventure. It's like old school space opera, right? These days, science fiction has gotten pretty dark. It's dark, it's grim, it's, particularly post Star Wars, a lot of the chrome and ray guns and just sort of sense of wonder. A lot of that has gradually been replaced with grime and grease and lots of detail, right? And there was something fundamentally optimistic and hopeful about some of the older sci-fi. And that's some of what we want, is we want that sense of joy, right? Like, as cheesy as that show was, I bet everybody watching had silly grins on their faces, right? Because there's just something joyful about it. And we want the game to have that sense of joy. We aren't only pulling from that. We're pulling from loads of golden age science fiction, the Asimov, the Heinlein, the, Andre Norton, that kind of stuff. We're pulling a lot from the comic book work of Mobius and of Jean-Claude Mézières, who's the artist who did Valerian and designed everything in The Fifth Element. He's a huge influence for us on what we're doing, and also actually was a huge influence on Star Wars. The visuals of that were very influential in Star Wars. So we're just going back and pulling some of these older references to get that. We want that sense of wonder. We want that sense of optimism. We think the real world right now is grimdark enough, and people want an escape. They want someplace they can go that they want to be. It kind of pervades what we're doing.
Thank you so much for sharing some of the key references that inspire the design and aesthetic of Stars Reach. And this is something, obviously, Greg is not an art director for Ultima Online, but, I think Greg and his team have, put a lot of thought over the years into how to represent Ultima Online to players. And indeed, they made some fairly important choices for the New Legacy Seasonal Shard, which they launched at the end of last year. And I'm curious, Greg, to hear a little bit about your thoughts about the importance of aesthetic and maybe some of your reactions as to what you've seen Rick share in terms of his live stream share on Google, and of course some of the references that Raph spoke about for Stars Reach.
Yeah, I think as designers, yet you have to put a little bit of yourself in everything that you create, right? So, from my perspective, I grew up a '90s kid, so think Toe Jam and Earl, Rocco's Modern Life, Nickelodeon, and that kind of stuff. And if you go back and you look at any of the content that I've done over the years for UO, there's a ton of little hints and nods to some of that stuff. I joked when the new Super Mario Brothers movie came out, there was all these kids running around with like Super Mario shirts on. I'm like, you don't even know, dude. Me and Mario are OG bros, so relax. But and then even outside of just the games that we play, our own personality goes into it. So for me, a huge part of my life is scuba diving. It's what I do if I'm not doing game stuff. And that has made its way into UO. I did a whole try and simulate underwater content type event with the Wreck of the Ararat and all that years ago. What I really appreciate is what Raph said about the nod to science fiction from a time when it was more optimistic and that sense of wonder. When I was in college, I had to take a literature class, and they all sounded really boring except one called science fiction literature. And I was like, "Oh, this sounds cool." And I learned more about science fiction than I ever cared to know, and it absolutely just opened my eyes to it. And if anybody has grew up in the '90s in the tri-state area, I'm originally from New Jersey. Basically, every spring break, you went to Walt Disney World for spring break. That's just like what you did. So it's like ingrained in your DNA. And where I'm going with this is if you go on Space Mountain, when you get off Space Mountain, there's this walkway, and you go through all of the different destinations that you can visit when you take the interstellar spaceship of vacation. And one of them is called the Coral Moons of Pisces 7. And every time I go by the Coral Moons of Pisces 7, doesn't matter if I'm 8 years old or 40 years old, I have a big shit-eating grin on my face because they've got it like a dog with a scuba helmet on, and I'm like, this is just the greatest. So I'm excited to see that kind of make its way back into games for sure.
Yeah, you get it.
Alongside a game's art style, Raph, character progression systems greatly shape the player experience. These can range from classless skill-based systems featured in MMOs like obviously Ultima Online to class-based systems such as the Profession system in Star Wars Galaxies. Could you share with us how you arrived at the character progression system for Stars Reach and how you think it will scale over time and in future content expansions?
Sure. This actually calls for context and history too. The MUDs before UO were mostly class based, and so they mostly played like EverQuest, right? Classes where you had tanks, nukers, healers. There was the Holy Trinity was there even then in the early '90s before MMOs came along. And one of the things that we wanted to, even before we got to UO, when I was working on Legend Mud and whatnot, was breaking out of that class structure because it didn't work very well with having ways to play that weren't combat centric. It didn't work very well with role playing, with crafting, and so on. And that wasn't much of a thing in most of those other MUDs, but it was in Legend Mud, and we wanted to have more diversity to it. That then fed into UO because Legend ended up being one of the very first classless MUDs on the internet. And we were pulling inspiration from a few pen and paper systems where we had an axioms system based on where you started. You might have more affinity for magic versus science or whatever. When we got to Ultima Online, there were several of us from Legend Mode on the original UO team, right? 3, later 4 of us were on UO. And we naturally brought some of those ideas with us. That's also how the resource system and so on came to be. We we're adding a whole bunch of new ways to play. Having pets was not really a thing in RPGs or games until UO. Tailoring your own clothing and outfit, being able to customize the colors wasn't really a thing. And so each of these things felt like they merited more. Now, on Legend Mod, we had been trying to implement skill tree, and we had been failing at it for years. It was a running joke that we were not getting anywhere with it. When we looked at UO, we talked about doing skill trees and ended up going with the system that everybody obviously all know, which is more like single tracks without branches in them, but percentage based. And that was because we wanted to try out use-based advancement, where just doing the thing lets you progress. Over the years, UO ended up migrating away from that, starting from fairly early. Having just a pure use-based system had a lot of oddities to it, right? Really susceptible to macroing, really susceptible to... We originally had learn by watching, which meant that people ended up losing some of their hard-earned GM status just because they were standing near somebody that was doing something different than they were. Work well. We had to turn that off, I think, during the beta, maybe the alpha. So, gradually it ended up with more and more tools for players, like being able to lock advancement and things like that. But the trees idea was still hanging out there. So when we got to galaxies, I pushed for us to do trees. We once again ran short on time for it. And as a result, all the trees in galaxies had exactly the same shape. And we didn't do use-based. Instead, we moved over to more results-based advancement, which is, you get XP from killing something, but also from crafting something, from exploring and whatnot. And that worked fairly well, I would say. People really enjoyed that system in Galaxies. It was still classless, but you had a skill cap. And so you could pick up, 2, 3 full professions, maybe. Or you could spread yourself across 10 or 20, as long as you didn't go too deep into the trees. And one of the big, of course, legendarily infamous patches was when that all got changed in favor of just doing classes with the NGE, New Game and Experience, New Game Enhancements, whatever it was called, which was a disastrously bad mistake in live, and to this day will result in people spitting at you in fury. Not something I was in favor of, by the way. So what we're doing with Galaxies is skill trees, but we are mixing up the idea of just getting XP for specific results. We're going to allow XP that is earned from other people using your crafted stuff. There are some professions that earn XP just from upvotes and likes. If you are a role player or entertainer or something like that, or a leader, you can earn experience points by other people saying, hey, you're great at this. Then it's basically very much like social media likes. And we don't think that's an exploit, because if you get 100 people to do that, that means you are actually good at leading those people. So you deserve those XP. So it's still very much a classless system, but thanks to having a skill cap, you do get that moment-to-moment interdependence. One big difference from Galaxies and UO is that we're going to let you learn everything in the game, but you can only have so many of them active. Or you can only keep so many of them in practice, is what we're calling it. And that basically means the equivalent would be, if you've worked your way up to, maxed out Spirit Speak or something, and then you give it up to go do something else, you can do that. And the wrinkle in Star's Reach is, if you ever say, you know what, never mind my magery, I want to go back to Spirit Speak, you can surrender the magery and just turn the Spirit Speak back on. And it will take about a week of real time, and then it will just come back. That lets us let you learn everything, but you don't have to do the grind all over again. But you can't swap it around so quick that you can take advantage of being everything at once, right? Like you can't tank mage it, so to speak, right? So it's basically an evolution off the systems with a few more ways to earn the experience. Some of which go back to the use-based stuff, right? And some of which kind of externalize it, like folks using your stuff rather than you using the stuff. So I've long believed that classes and levels in the classic version of D&D levels, they weren't ever really made for virtual worlds. They were made for D&D, where you played in small groups in campaigns and everybody leveled together. And part of the point was that you formed almost like a little sports team. And that isn't really the way that we play in online worlds. It's not a bad way to play, but, online worlds, you play with all levels at once. The whole campaign is live at the same, and so on. So it always felt to me, ever since the days of Legend Mode, like a piece of traditional MMO design that needed to be reinvented.
It's still very early days, and obviously, you and the team are focused on your prototype, and, we will eventually end up in alpha and beta for Stars Reach. But looking past the initial launch experience and, that system and content, how do you envision these skills scaling with expansions for Stars Reach?
Well, even at our initial launch, we're planning over 40 professions, and that will be thousands of skill boxes. I think our current list is at around 1,600 individual skill boxes. So one nice thing about going with a system like this is that it's a bit easier to expand and extend, right? One of the challenges with the system that we originally used is you can't really say, okay, now the bar goes to 230 instead of 100. It doesn't give you the same freedom to just add stuff at the top, which is one advantage of levels, right? They do let you do that. It's one of the traps also, but that's a separate topic. With trees, the big thing that we're able to do is we can just add more along the side as branches and kind of grow sideways, not just vertically. And as long as the things you are adding offer fresh and new ways to play, then it feels, it adds to the complexity of the system. It gives you more ways to do stuff. And, UO ended up doing that via a variety of other methods, right? Like when gear progression got added in and so on. You do always need to keep adding things to do in these games, right? And so, whatever system you end up with, it's got to be something you can keep expanding.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, how a player progresses through whatever the world ends up being is always going to be a question of what do you want that user experience to be like, right? Like if you look at UO, for example, some of the stuff that Raph described that they're doing in Stars Reach kind of made its way into UO over the years. So like the idea that you could like swap skills and stuff like that out, I think they did with Samurai Empire's release with Soul Stones and things like that. But just more ways for players to customize their characters, because it goes back to you've got to give something to go after, right? Ultimately, we're only so many people on so many days and weeks of development, and it doesn't matter. I don't care how big of a content cluster you make. It almost seems like players are going to just churn through it 10 times as fast as you can make it. So making these interesting decisions about how skills progress and what different professions are, I think, is one of the most exciting and challenging problems for designing any kind of new MMO or let alone RPG for that matter. So, listening to the thought process on kind of how that's folding out, especially given how the progression from UO to Star Wars Galaxies and now to Stars Reach is interesting, because who else is there that has done this many times, right? How many times have you developed design skill trees and stuff in your career?
Yeah, it's funny because it's definitely true in the MMO space, right? That I've got a lot of colleagues who have been in games about the same amount of time that I have, and their list of credits is literally 10 times longer, because MMOs, they take a lot of time and work. And yeah, and of course half the ones I worked on never shipped either, right? Which is, that's pretty common in games. 90% of your career is often invisible to the player, right? Because cancellation is such a common thing. So yeah, I guess there's folks out there. Mark Jacobs, of course. Jake Song's been doing this as long as any of us. Yeah, there's folks who've been doing it a really, really long time, since that earliest boom. Sadly, we've also lost a few folks who were in that cohort of the early 90s, right? I mean, we lost Brad McQuaid of EverQuest fame. We lost Mike Sellers, who did Meridian 59, worked on Sims Online, worked on Realm of the Mad God. So yeah, we've had some losses from that original community too, which I guess happens. We're all in our 50s or older now.
Going back to what you've spoken about in the past, Raph, I think that you were part of a pioneering cohort of developers at the dawn of this genre when there was no roadmap and there were no rules. And as you said, you all were a very close, tight-knit group of friends and colleagues and peers. I think that, the industry and players around the world were richer for your friendships. So thank you for sharing that. I do have one question for Greg here, me being the selfish Ultima Online player that I am. Given the fact that we have this seasonal shard experience to look forward to, could we, obviously this is, nothing written in stone, but could in the future seasons, you and the team design a custom skill that would be tied into a future season of New Legacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the core reasons that we wanted to do New Legacy was because it afforded us almost like a blank slate where we didn't have to slot it into at whatever point the production charts were, right? That was becoming an increasingly challenging problem for us to solve. Like, we've got a million ideas, but then, they die a slow death on the cutting floor when it's like, well, that's not going to work because 15 years ago we did this. And the kind of running joke is that, like, old self is that guy. What did he do? There are times when I've been digging through scripts that I wrote when I first joined the team that I don't remember writing at this point anymore. And I'm like, who wrote this? What is this trash? And then it's like, oh, right, I did. But, as far as how that relates to New Legacy and stuff, it gives us this kind of clean slate to be a little bit more experimental. We haven't added a new skill since Stygian Abyss with all of the imbuing and things like that. We've reworked some of the skills with the first season of New Legacy to kind of streamline things and soften the kind of complexity a little bit. But I mean, that would be really exciting to do a completely new skill set. I have often, going back to my scuba diving obsession, really wanted to get into the water, more so than just having water terrain that ships kind of just move across, and swimming and spearfishing. I don't know, the imagination is the limit. And then of course we have the technical challenges, but fortunately our engineer Steven, he's been on the team longer than I have, and he's pretty eager to always challenge the envelope there. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible.
Cheers to Bleak. We have another comment from Matt here who's just cropping up all over this conversation saying, get weird with the new seasons. Britannia flooded, aka Waterworld. Britannia ravaged with fires, and wood is the most valuable resource. Don't give Greg and team some crazy ideas here, Matt. But no, that is very exciting to hear that you have a new stage on which to experiment on and build upon there, Greg. To you, Raph, one of the most distinctive features of Star Wars Galaxies that I was always fascinated about, I'm wondering if this could make a reappearance in some shape or form for Star's Reach. You guys took a really radical approach to players eventually being able to unlock a Jedi profession in the first iteration of Star Wars Galaxies. And I always thought that was such a fascinating approach to take when it came to obviously offering a base stock of classes, and then within that base stock of classes embedding a secret hidden class that no one really knew how to attain when the game first released. Do you have plans to create some hidden professions within Star's Reach, either on launch or possibly in the future? I'm wondering if some of that, I don't know what you call it, some of that sense of discovery will make it back into Star's Reach.
Well, arguably Jedi killed Star Wars Galaxies. So, Star Wars, the time period of the game was supposed to be that Jedi were incredibly powerful and also incredibly rare, but all the players wanted to be one. We never found a way really to hit all three of those pillars: rare, but everybody can be one, and powerful, right? So the system that we tried in Galaxies early on, we wanted to make it so that it was essentially a hardcore mode straight out of Diablo. You could choose to play hardcore as a Jedi and suffer permadeath. And essentially, we'd score you based on how long you managed to stay alive. That didn't make it in for a variety of reasons, and we ended up with a secret unlock that relied on security through obscurity, which is never a good idea, because once hints started dropping at the behest of marketing, everybody figured out the secret method, and everybody went and played Jedi. And that meant that they all played ways that they didn't really like, because shiny Jedi was too shiny to resist. And that it sent player satisfaction over a cliff. It really did. Players really just didn't enjoy it as much. And until those hints started dropping, the game had been growing. And once those hints started dropping, it started going the other way. We started losing more people than we were getting. And I totally believe it was due to people playing in ways they didn't like. So my chief takeaway from it was never do an alpha class again, right? Like, and I didn't want to do it in the first place, right? I was like, it'd be a lot easier if we just didn't let players be Jedi at all. But, we were overruled on that one. The way the MGE solved it, Jedi's a starter class and aren't that powerful. So they weren't special. And to me, that's like, putting a knife in the heart of Star Warsiness a little bit. Yes, it means that everybody can play with their glowy stick and fulfill the childhood fantasy, but when Jedi are a dime a dozen everywhere, and in the name of game balance are not particularly, tougher or, than anybody else, right? It loses a lot of the magic and the mysticism that made Jedi cool for me personally. I still argue with Damian Schubert, who went on to do design on Star Wars: The Old Republic, about it. Because it's like, I don't get it. Just let them all be Jedi. It's what players want. And we have that debate every once in a while.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and it goes to show what reads as exciting on paper for someone like myself. Obviously, I didn't play Star Wars Galaxies, but on paper, it sounded fascinating to me. But as you said, the way the players experienced that, or the way they were funneled into discovering or unlocking the Jedi class, was an entirely different experience as far as the feedback that we're getting. So, it goes to show that no plan survives contact with the player base. Another great comment from Matt. Matt's all over this place right now. Shout out to your blog and later post-mortem book where you talked about how the holocron-based skill identifier system for Jedi came to be. It was really fascinating. As a player at the time, I made the choice not to go for Jedi because I didn't want to give up my droid engineer character. I want to thank everyone who is here with us in-game on the new Legacy Shard of Ultima Online right now. I am joined by Matt on his character Jeppeth. Obviously, Greg is here under his persona of Chironics. And we got Crispy saying huzzah. Obviously, he's Lord Crispy. And in fact, designer dragon Ralph Koster himself would have joined us in the new Legacy version of Britannia had it not been for a fight with the classic Yo web client. So, shame on you, ASIC web client. Maybe for a future occasion, we can arrange that.
Yeah, I have successfully used it before. I don't know why it didn't work today.
So, moving back to Star's Reach, one of the standout features promises players the prospect of exploring hundreds of worlds. Could you share with us if you're going to take a procedural approach, similar to at least Elite Dangerous's Stellar Forge in the Endless Galaxies featured in No Man's Sky, or are you going to take a handcrafted approach, or a mixture of the two?
It's definitely procedural. So we procedurally generate planets. Planets are connected via, basically sectors of space are connected via wormholes, which, if you think Elite Dangerous, that's like being connected via a warp. If you think No Man's Sky, it's similar to what happens in those games, or warping in Eve, right? And then from the space sector, you can get to the local planets, right? The things that are local in the system. The system, if you think about it that way, it's set up kind of like a graph, right? So we procedurally generate these planets. We can add new planets to the galaxy as people explore. If people don't go to planets, the wormhole collapses through inactivity, and the planet and the associated specter of space might be lost. So it is an ever-changing map, which ties into what happens on the planets and the space zones. Because everything is simulated, it is possible to mine all the gold off of a planet, leave it Swiss cheese. It's an industrial hellhole with nothing but mines and factories. It's possible to pave it over and turn it into a city it's possible to preserve it as a pastoral world where everybody lives in happy suburbia, right? It's really up to the players. So the mainstream of MMO design can't afford to change its maps very much. Even No Man's Sky, the planets reset basically when you leave, right? They call it the healing of the terrain, right? We actually do what we started doing with UO, which was have persistence of everything, right? Well, with Stars Reach, we're actually able to persist absolutely everything. The state of the terrain, all of it. And because we model and simulate it to the degree that we do, all of it can evolve and change. So we use ProcGen to create the initial state of a planet. But then the seasons start running and the lakes freeze in the winter and they thaw. And the rivers that flow actually erode the riverbanks. And a meteor shower might happen and it hits a forest and the forest burns down. And then players can plant new trees and grow them back. It's all dynamic. And planets can be used up or brought back from the brink through player actions. So it's extremely procedural. And the only parts that we're really going to handcraft are going to be essentially the newbie starter worlds that we use as tutorials and training grounds. The rest of it is all malleable. It can all change and evolve, live and die.
That is fascinating. Greg, your thoughts on Playable Worlds' approach to content for Stars Reach?
I mean, it sounds awesome. To be honest, I can't wait to play it. I have a general rule that I don't play anything until it's in full release, and there's two reasons for that. Number one is I spend all day in front of a computer monitor, and the rest of my family, they keep me away from it as much as possible, lest they're all health nuts, so lest my exercise goals get shamed. But beyond that, I think once you take a look behind the curtain and you start getting into how these games are crafted and what actually it takes, I try to keep myself away from the toxicity of people's comments in early game development. Like, it is such an immense undertaking that unless you've done it, you really don't know what it's going to take. So I wait until the full thing's out, and from having seen what Raph and the team have done with Stars Reach, I mean, I played quite a bit of No Man's Sky. I mean, I play UO all day, every day, creating stuff for it, but I also play a ton of other games, and space exploration is is at the top of that genre list. So I played a ton of No Man's Sky, and I had a lot of fun with it, but it definitely lacked some of the features that Raph has been talking about. So for what you can accomplish in terms of exploration, I think that anybody who's into adventuring is going to be all over it. And, I'm one of those players, so I'm super, super excited to see what they can do.
Yeah, I think this touches on, one of the great challenges that MMO developers ran into as the genre evolved. And I think this is articulated best by you, Raph. There's an article on GamesRadar.com, and the headline for the article reads as such: as Ultima Online approaches its 28th birthday, former creative lead reveals what it takes for an MMO to last for decades and why they sometimes fail. And then in quote it says, content does not last forever. And I think that you had in the early days of the industry an attempt to keep up with the player base through content. And as Greg has just shared here, developing content for any game, including MMOs, in terms of a handcrafted experience is incredibly labor intensive. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources, and it rarely is enough to keep the player base happy for long. They're always almost immediately chomping the upper tier of that content and demanding more of it. So I think that it is exciting that you're going to be leaning very heavily into a prop gen approach to much of the content experience for Stars Reach. And obviously, we've come a far way here in 2025 in terms of what can be done with that. And I also think that it speaks to, why I'm so excited about what the Broadsword Online Games team is doing now with Ultima in the way of sort of tackling that issue with a seasonal shard. So Greg, did you kind of land in that same sort of thought space as a team when it came to finding ways of delivering fresh content experience for tens of thousands of Ultima Online players out there as well through the seasonal shard?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you touched on it pretty much succinctly as I think anybody could. Like, making content is hard, making content is expensive, it's work intensive. So anything you can do to lessen that load is going to be favorable for the project. I'll tell you a quick anecdote with kind of, if you go back and play Shadowguard, which we did for the Time of Legends, that was inspired by a brief addiction that I had to GTA Online. I became obsessed with heists. I thought they were a ton of fun. I've always loved bank robber stories. I think I've probably seen Ocean's 11 a bazillion times. And I remember when those first came out, one of the things that hit the media was that players loved it and they wanted more. And at the time, Rockstar came out and said something to the effect of like, we will try, but these are really hard for us to do. And that caught me because it's like, if Rockstar can't like bring it out, like if they can't do it, then who else can? Because they're such a massive company with so much in terms of resources available to them. So I think what you have to do is you have to be scrappy. I think you have to be a little bit creative in terms of thinking out of the box. And that's what we try to do with New Legacy, is think of ways where we could make fundamental changes that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do to create an experience that is familiar but slightly different.
To the excitement, I think, of both projects, Stars Reach is, by industry standards today, a small team. And indeed, Broadsword Online Games, the Ultima Online team, is also, a small, scrappy team. But it was Raph and a small, scrappy team back in 1996 and 1995 that brought an MMO that's lasted over 30 years. And I think that speaks to the ingenuity, really, of both of my guests here on the podcast today. This also is a great segue into my next questions. As Greg here could tell you, the tools at your disposal to create content can make a huge difference when supporting a game like Stars Reach or Ultima Online. And Ultima Online's development tools, for example, have been known to be incredibly labor-intensive. Greg could tell you a story about working on one of the expansions, Time of Legends, when he was using the tool set to create a new landmass. How are you and the team ensuring you have the right tools to aid in developing new content for Stars Reach players?
Yeah, there's some elements where we are leaning on some tried and true things, and there's other elements where we really took a step back, right? So to pick something tried and true, the scripting language that is in UO, Wombat, is what was used to really make most of the game, right? That general architecture idea of there being a game engine and having a scripting system on top of it actually is something that can speed up development very powerfully, because doing long builds is one of the slowest parts of game development. So being able to make game systems in a way where you can hot reload and move as much of the game into data as possible is a very powerful kind of architectural element. And we doubled down on that a lot. In fact, our system allows us to add art to the game on the fly without having to patch the client. Instead, the art can just stream down on the fly. We can add whole new game systems without bringing the servers down, right? And that helps us iterate faster in development, not just make live ops smoother. So those were ideas that were implicit in how UO worked way back when. A lot of game tech is not really built for live services. I often joke that if the web worked the way game engines do, Amazon would need to patch Chrome every time a new object went for sale on Amazon. If you think about it, it sounds bananas, right? But games tend to still work that way for a whole bunch of reasons, even good reasons, right? Baking art into the clients gives you room for certain kinds of performance optimizations, right? But it's disruptive to service and it slows down your iteration speed. So trade-offs, but we lean towards whatever allows the developer to play jazz, lets them try to iterate, because finding the fun is paramount. So we lean in that direction. And then for things like maps, because we lean so heavily on ProcGen, the challenge would be to do what in AI circles is called the oatmeal problem, where you can procedurally generate a lot of bowls of oatmeal, but can anybody really care about the differences between them? I mean, they are individually unique, but after a while you go, it's just more oatmeal, right? And a lot of terrain generation systems and ProcGen systems have that problem. Now, it's a problem that has been solved, right, in many ways by different tools and techniques. So we lean in on a bunch of those solutions. We don't just randomly generate worlds. We actually have a tool chain that lets our world builders do things like say the canyons need to be this wide for good combat. The slopes should be this steep to make traversal interesting. We need them to bend at this kind of frequency because of view distance, etc. They can actually build almost like templates that are really algorithms using a tool interface that lets them snap nodes together. And what they're really doing is building the algorithms and the instructions for the procgen. And so once they make something that is cool and fun, they can always make more of it with different layouts that will still have the right width canyons, the right size vistas, the right slopes on the cliffs, and so on. We've invested a lot of effort into that in order to make sure that it's really easy for us to generate new worlds off of these designer-driven templates in ways that are oriented around them being fun rather than oriented just around, oatmeal.
That's a great answer. And, too, the tool set for, generating, for powering your own version of a Stellar Forge for Star's Reach. You did say that handcrafted content will exist, but it will probably exist in very specific areas of the game, including the new player experience. Could we expect handcrafted experiences, like, let's say, a handcrafted planet in future expansions? Is that a possibility players could look forward to? Because I know that there has been, like, Starfield's a good example of that debate, I guess, the most recent game from Bethesda, where players seem to bounce off the amount of procedurally generated experiences and were clamoring for some of that handcrafted experience that Bethesda had been known for from Morrowind and Skyrim.
Yeah, it's important to not rely solely on the procgen, right? It's important to have things in there that are handcrafted and also procedural forms of content that can be built out of handcrafted parts, right? Actually, some of the earliest experiments that we did with this were in UO, and actually they stopped spawning because the houses filled up every possible clearing. I wonder if the code's still in there, but spawning orc camps and wizard towers and things like that, where you could handcraft something that could appear as a complete encounter, and in theory could include handcrafted quests or content or dialogue or whatever. And back on UO, we figured out a way to make those spawn complete as long as there was room on the map. Then players filled all the empty spots on the map with houses and they never popped again. But when we called those dynamic points of interest, because the industry lingo was to call the handcrafted ones points of interest, right? Particularly in RPG design at the time, one of the things that, Richard Garriott would say is, if you're wandering around the map of Ultima 8 or 9, you must encounter a point of interest every, 5 minutes or whatever. Something distinctive. So that dynamic point of interest idea, we were able to do it again in Galaxies. And actually that tech is also what unlocked in-world player housing in Galaxies and player bases and the faction system and a bunch of other systems. So we're planning on leveraging similar ideas into Star's Reach as well. Ultimately, Star's Reach has a much more malleable world, right, than those other games. So we have to be a little more cautious about how we integrate the content. So, we have procgen routines that we've been working on that are specifically for doing things like carving rectilinear labyrinths inside of mountains, things that can be more like dungeons, things that can serve as forgotten alien laboratories or, Khazad-dûm or whatever, because you can't just generate organic things, right? You need to have other things there that are interesting, where you can leave behind things for players to discover that advance the storyline, produce lore, all of that kind of stuff.
That's a great answer. And kind of touching into that, and I know you answered a little bit of it in that response, Raph, but we have a comment here from Travers saying, Ultima Online had great dungeons that were suspenseful and rewarding. I've already seen some mind-blowing cave systems in Star's Reach. What can we expect as far as dungeons, and will these caves naturally populate their own ecosystems that might present risks and rewards themselves?
Yes. So one of the things that we are doing, so yes, they can naturally populate their own ecosystems. One of the things that we are doing, and this is actually going in, it's in development right now, is that we are bringing back elements of the dynamic ecology that were in UO. Those who played Galaxies might remember that there were lairs for creatures, and these served essentially as spawners for creatures. And when you found a lair, you might also find baby creatures and whatnot that you could then grab and raise as pets. We're taking that lair kind of a system even further, allowing lairs to grow in size, propagate, and spread across the map. So creatures will actually spread and establish homes within a given ecological niche. The lairs will only spread where it is suitable for that species. So it's a cave-dwelling species. The lairs will not spread outside. They prefer living in caves, and so on. So they're also destructible, which means that it is possible to drive a species extinct on a planet if you exterminate all of their lairs. So yeah, dungeons will come populated with an initial ecosystem. It doesn't mean it will always be there. And we sometimes talk in terms of dungeon planets, that an entire planet might serve the role of being a dungeon that players come into, exterminate, defeat, and then the planet can just go away because it's not interesting anymore.
That's a great answer. Very exciting answer. Greg, your thoughts there on this sort of question regarding tool sets and how they facilitate or hinder development?
Yeah, I think that's one of the nice things about developing something new, particularly given the experience that Raph has had, right? We kind of get this question a lot on the UO side of things where it's like, well, it's not 1997 anymore, and now there's more computing power probably in my cell phone than existed back then. Why can't you just do whatever somebody's asking us in UO? And the real reason is because, yes, the technology that's available and the computing power that's available to us is definitely upgraded, but very little has changed in the underlying server architecture and the underlying scripting architecture in UO. Kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about, finding little code archaeologist morsels from Raph and the other devs that have worked on the game over the years. That's all very much the way it was back in the late 90s and whenever it was implemented. So, having that hindsight is definitely rewarding from a production perspective, but it's not to say that you also can't teach an old dog new tricks. And we've tried to do that with a number of different systems with UO, but you always have to balance kind of the downtime and what the resource cost is going to be of upgrading something. And then there's I call it the UO factor, basically like it's been touched by so many different people over the years, and there's so many different integrations and codependencies in the underlying code base that there's always unintended consequences. I'll tell you a quick story with the most recent publish we did where we had that issue where players were inadvertently able to dye pets with dye tubs. Now, one of the other universal truths of UO development over the years is that if a designer has implemented something in Wombat once before, then let's implement it again in another iteration. So we've got like 8 dye tub scripts. And in none of those dye tub scripts is there a check to verify that the thing that you are using the dye tub on is not a mobile. So the assumption was always is that the object IDs for the mobiles did not overlap with the object IDs for the equipment. And for a long, long time, that was the case until the most recent batch of creatures that we did started to creep into that range. And that's why some folks were able to hue their Triton pets. We did see the feedback and everybody was really excited about being able to get different colors of that creature. So I would not be surprised if in the future you didn't find Triton treats that were able to change the color of those. So a little bit of serendipity there.
So the two things on that. When I did the original dye tub, the way that I did that check was like checking if the item was made of the cloth resource.
There you go.
But if the resource part is now hard to work with, then oh well. And one minor thing, because you mentioned less power than your phone, I actually looked it up for one of the UO postmortems. Less power than this watch.
Wow, that's incredible.
But you could host UO on this.
That's a great story, Greg, and I did see the happily surprised posts on the official forums about people being able to actually dye their pets. And speaking of time, we are heading towards the very last part of our conversation here. Raph and his colleague here, Rick Reynolds, and you too, Greg, you've been very obliging your time. So I have just a few last questions to round out what has been a really rich conversation that unites the past with the present and the future here. We are on the threshold of 12 days left on the Kickstarter for Stars Reach, and we're now knocking on the door of $600,000 of small donor support. What has that meant for you and the team? And as a part two, once we do hit that happy threshold of $600,000 on the Kickstarter, players will unlock the next official playable species, the Fae. Could you share with us a little bit about what we can look forward to with the next Kickstarter unlock tier?
Sure. As far as what it's meant, it's just been amazing to see the support. The money from the Kickstarter is not meant to be what it takes to make the game. We are in pre-alpha now. We are throwing systems into the game at a very rapid rate at this point. We generally add whole new systems every 3 weeks. So our pace of development, thanks to all of that time spent on tools, is really, really good. So a lot of the point of the Kickstarter was to demonstrate to the world that there is a market that wants this and that wants, the alternate worlds and realities back and not just, endless leveling and XP treadmills. And we feel like we've been successful at that. People are showing that. People are excited about the idea of something that carries on the tradition of UO and Galaxies and other fellow travelers like, original Arcade or Eve and so on. It's been just amazing to see the community support. That's been wonderful. The 600K threshold unlocks the Fae. The Fae species have always been super important to the lore of Stars Reach. In fact, we have the first 2 parts of a 3-part lore story are up on the website right now, and it kind of is a look at the very early history of the galaxy as we know it now, and a bit of an origin story for how it is that we ended up with the way that the galaxy and the setting are today. So it's sort of a glimpse into the past. I'm trying to avoid spoilers for the climax. The Fae are interesting in that they are kind of mystical. They're the only one of our player species that does not have a homeworld that any of us can find in the game. But none of the homeworlds are accessible to players. You emigrate out from them and you never go back. We're not going to replicate Earth, right? But the Fae believe that they came from the mystical land of Tir Nan Og, where magic worked, and their wings actually let them fly. And the rest of the galaxy treats that all as their hokey old-time religion, right? There's a segment of the Fae that really still believe it. But in the meantime, the mystery of where they did come from, where was this Tir Nan Og? What planet is this? Where is it located? Is one of the things for players to work towards discovering in the game. In the meantime, the Fae have been living, I like saying, almost like fleas aboard the giant servitor. These are the giant robot ships that fly around the galaxy, tending the different terraform planets that were left behind by our progenitor species that we just know as the old ones. And so they've been living aboard those ships. They're the original spacefaring sort of humanity. And, they lived as stowaways. And how they went from being stowaways to one of the 8 player species is essentially the story that we're telling with that lore that we're posting step by step. So with any luck, we will unlock both the last chapter of that lore and visuals for the species within the next 5 days or so.
That's very exciting. And I love how there already seems to be a deep ocean of story and lore for players to slowly uncover with Stars Reach. We have a quick comment here from Matt saying, Greg, let me play Ultima Online on my iWatch. It would be great for my day job. So there's a little, appeal there from one of our community members to get Ultima Online on the iWatch. Could happen. And we also have a great question. It goes back to this groundswell of support that we're seeing for Stars Reach on the Kickstarter. The fact that you've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars and beat your fundraising goal within an hour or under an hour. I forget exactly how long it took, but you whizzed by almost right away. Avaros here on Discord says, what are you hoping to achieve with the Stars Reach community to retain users and build the community from within itself apart from the game being updated? For example, content creator player recognition programs, playing with the community in special events, and live streams like this one, etc.
In many ways, we built the game to do this. So I'm going to rattle off a whole bunch of things here. Back on UO, when the first player cities first started getting made, we had no way of recognizing them. And I really wanted to add town stones as a variant on guild stones, because I'd written the code for guilds and guild stones originally. And I wanted to allow players to found towns. In Galaxies, we did allow that. It was one of the most popular features. There was a politician skill track. Players could found cities. They could set laws within the cities and the like. Here we are extending that for communities. They are able to claim an entire planet. They can govern it. The planet has a health bar. They have to maintain it, keep it alive, lest the servitors come by and punish them for allowing things like the genetic diversity of the planet to be destroyed. So that's a big community goal, and it has a lot of asynchronous gameplay mechanisms, progressing your town by everybody in the town, all the citizens, depositing resources and learning and whatnot into central stores, kind of like building rune libraries, only now the game recognizes it and levels up the town as you build up its infrastructure together by providing actually a lot of the kinds of things that happen in UO, like bulk order deeds and things like that. The town will be asking for them in order for you to level up the town. So the idea of players controlling planets is really at the heart of what we're doing with the community. And the hope is that eventually we allow players to even start to extend and mod those planets a bit. Imagine if they could start creating the NPCs, tailoring their planet more, right? Like there's tons of creative people out there, letting them really take control of their planets and make it into something that other people want to come visit. We're also doing things that integrate content creators from outside the game into the game. So besides the politician track, besides the entertainer tracks that we're going to have, we're planning on having a writer or journalist track in the game. There's an in-game news net, which is essentially think of it as the in-game chat channel social media system. But players are able to unlock owning their own channels on there if they level up in journalism. And if you are somebody who's a streamer or something like that, you can post your streams there. With any luck, you know, if more of the internet used RSS, we could just notify automatically without people having to post manually. Maybe we can do integrations with third-party partners. Newsnet can carry the news of the outside streams that you're doing, your outside blogs, whatever it is, your videos. Players can subscribe to you. When they give you likes, you earn experience points in journalism. When you level up in journalism, as you acquire new skills, you can get things like drone cameras, so your streams can be from fresh angles on the action, or chyrons that you can superimpose on your screen so that you can, be a reporter. And then those things make your streams outside of the game better and cooler, right? And gosh, I hope that we get to the point where we're seeing people do news broadcasts about the game in full cosplay, right? And taking advantage of these tools, because these days, the gaming community does not exist just inside a game. Here we are in Discord, which has taken the place of forums and ICQ before it and whatever. These days, a gaming community spreads itself out, right? And we want to make sure that we recognize that activity because it's incredibly important to the success of the game. And one of the things that sticking with just the levels and classes model does is it kind of passively discourages you from playing the game in ways that don't earn you XP, right? Because of the opportunity cost. You fall behind if you spend time role-playing. So we're trying to make sure that we recognize as many of these critical ways to play as we can and reward people in the game for it, so that it's something that we encourage people to do because it drives so much community. It's so important. And then that lets us do things like live streams and whatnot. Someday, the dreaded cornucopia infection, enemy of the servitors, the biological hive mind, might send you a missive saying, "Hello, greetings, citizens of this planet. We have scheduled your absorption into our collective hive mind for 7 p.m. on Thursday night. Kindly gather up all the citizens of your planet and RSVP to let us know if that's an appropriate time for your molecular disintegration and consumption and integration. Don't worry, once we're done, you'll never be lonely again. And if you can't make it, that's okay. We're immortal. We'll ask again next week." So we're really trying to make a game that can have these events and these activities, but fit into people's modern, constantly interrupted lives, that rewards the ways that people interact with games today, right? Because we're trying to take steps forward, right? I'm sure Greg has seen all these games come and go that say they're just trying to recapture what UO used to be. And we're trying to be forward looking, right? We're trying to look towards what sandbox games can be and push the boundaries.
What a phenomenal answer. Matt says, Raph, you're going to have a ton of journalist academics knocking on your door for this system. And Crispy says, this sounds like the metaverse, but Raph will actually do it. And I agree. I think that's very exciting. And, this kind of reminds me to, I think you have long recognized, Raph, is the importance of community engagement when it comes to the success of a game as a service. And you of course, had that very memorable talk at GDC with, your former colleagues from Origin Systems Incorporated on your work for Ultima Online. And you did say that you actually were able to draw a direct correlation between users and the level of engagement that you were able to have with them. So I think that if there's anything that we can know about Stars Reach and the Playable Worlds team is that we can expect a lot of that great sort of connection with the player base on the part of the developers that we can look forward to. Greg, do you want to tackle any of that? I'm just curious because it was a broad topic. Feel free to stat wherever you might want to sort of comment upon before we move on to our last question here.
I think that anytime anybody pushes the envelope in this business, everybody benefits. There has been far too much, and Raph just said it, of recapturing this of Ultima Online, right? This title has become so revered as a piece of both gaming history and a piece of people's individual identity, just merely out of the longevity of it and how many generations have played it and things like that. So I always say imitation is cheap, but forward thinking and pushing the envelope of what is possible is really exciting. So I think, like I said, it makes all of us better and it challenges us to unlock new ideas. And I think what Raph has described will only further to do that, hopefully industry-wide, because I think at our heart, we're all gamers, even though we may do this for a living. Like, if you don't enjoy doing this as a hobby, then you probably have a very miserable work-life balance. But, anything that can inspire us within our development community and then how we can create those experiences for players is super exciting, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and to that statement, I do think that, you and the team at Broadsword Online Games are also pushing the envelope too and trying out new ideas. The Seasonal Shard is great evidence of that. There is sort of like this, there was a real push within the industry, within the genre, to approach classic experiences or provide classic experiences to players. And I thought it was very daring of you folks and very well thought out to do something different for Ultima Online, for both, veteran players, returning players, and new players. So it's exciting to see that as Raph and his team move forward with a new vision for Stars Reach, you and your colleagues for Broadsword are achieving something fresh and exciting for Ultima Online as well.
And I will just say one other thing on the community side of it. Like, the community is what makes these projects not only sustainable, but it gives them life, right? Like, otherwise it's just pixels on a screen. So it's always been about the people. And I think that so long as developers recognize that, they will enjoy success. And when they lose sight of it, then, they don't. So I'm really happy that we share that common goal.
Raph, Greg, you both have been very generous with your time here. And this has been such a great honor for myself as a content creator, a moment that I certainly won't forget. I do have one last question before I finally I'll let you go, Raph and Greg, to go about your days. Very busy days ahead for both of you. As Greg here will confirm, working on any MMO is a monumentally difficult task with many tough and disappointing days frequently. I'm always curious to find out where you and your team find the inner fire for this career. And what is it about Stars Reach and the team that you're working with that helps keep your own inner fire burning bright for yourself, Raph, after all these years?
Well, that's actually a hard one. I've often said that the main reason I make games is because I like doing too many different things, and games lets me do all of them. I get to do some art and do writing and code and invent systems and do games and do community stuff and right. So in that sense, it's the right job for distractible me. I think a huge thing that then ends up motivating is knowing that there's an audience that wants what you're doing, right? An audience that cares. There are plenty of creative endeavors that I engage in that I don't have an audience for, right? Like you can, I don't put music out, and yet you can look around me here on screen, see, right? I don't particularly put music out. I do every once in a while, but not often, right? And it's different when you're doing it for yourself, for the creative satisfaction. But there's certain projects, there's certain things that are too big for you to do on your own. MMOs are definitely one of those. And so having a team means that you can't just do it for personal satisfaction. It has to be everybody's satisfaction. It has to be investor satisfaction. And it's crucial that you have an audience that cares, an audience that gives a damn. And so, when it gets tough, and it absolutely gets tough, it's the fact that there's an audience out there that wants it that really keeps you going.
I think that for me personally, at this point in my life, I don't know that I'd be good at anything else. No. But, I pinch myself every day that I get to do this and that I've been able to do it for so long. It's uncommon, and we talked about this the last time we chatted, for anybody to work on a project for as long as a lot of the UO team has been working on a project. We talked about Bonnie's legacy on this game for, the better part of 2 decades here in some manner or another. Like, that just doesn't happen. So there is just something unique about the UO experience that becomes baked into your personality. And for those of us who are fortunate enough to work on it, we take very seriously the responsibility of stewarding this thing that we all care so much about. And I think that's what keeps us going. And then to the point of, the audience side of it, yeah, it's like when there's people out there who are interested and you can bring them enjoyment and you can bring them entertainment, that's a really rewarding process. That is, people oftentimes, oh, what do you do? And then you tell them you work in games and their eyes light up. And they always want to share some anecdote about a game that was so core to their childhood, because it's when most of us play games, right? And ultimately, it's just about having fun and making people have fun and just offering them the ability to kind of escape from the everyday doldrums of the world and just kind of get lost in this little virtual world of our imaginations.
This has been such an exciting conversation. Once again, I want to thank you for your time, Raph and Greg. I want to thank everyone here at the end of the conversation at Discord who joined us and listened in and asked questions. Arborlus, Crispy, Delphons, John, Trevor, Trinidadian, and of course the hundreds and thousands of people who will discover this video and this podcast in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Thank you all for stepping in a conversation that I wanted to unite the past with the present and once again look ahead into the future. And I do want to thank you, Raph, both of you really, but you especially, Raph, for setting a cornerstone upon which a genre was in part built upon, which has served as a stage for some very rich developer careers, including Greg, Bonnie, and many of their colleagues who've worked on Ultima Online over the years. And as you move forward with Stars Reach and you try to sort of rationale the value of Stars Reach to an outside public, I would just point them to your legacy. It's Ultima Online that has gone on strong for 30 years, that has never really been arguably replaced by another game in terms of an experience, and continues to grow and evolve in exciting ways. A seed that you planted so long ago. It goes back to the many Star Wars Galaxy gray shards that now exist that capture the magic that you and your team created. And I just think it speaks to the value of you as a designer, your imagination, and your creativity. And I think we're all very fortunate that you want to try again with Stars Reach and are excited to work on a game like Stars Reach. We are so very fortunate. And I am so very undeservedly lucky to have had an hour of your time here along with Greg's. I am well aware of your significance to the history of game development and the audiences that you've spoken to throughout your career. So it is certainly my hope that this conversation goes out into the ether of the World Wide Webs and finds listening ears and caring hearts. And I would encourage everyone to visit Stars Reach webpage and the ongoing Kickstarter, and think of lending your support to an MMO legend. And indeed, I want you both, Greg, Raph, and your two respective games, Ultima Online and Stars Reach, to live long and prosper.
Well, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
The honor was all mine.